Hey, today's StarCraft 2 history, I'm going to be talking about the final tournaments of 2011, the ones I've yet to cover. And even though it ends with Dongrigu versus MMA as the great culmination of the rivalry, the next taking up of the guard, I generally call this era the Leenock jjakji jump, even though they both of them are only in one GSL finals, and neither of them are as relevant as either MMA or Dongegu. And the reason I call it the Leenock jjakji jump is because at the end of 2011, you see a rise of skill all across the players where they started to get StarCraft 2 in a sense, and they got it on a much deeper level than previously seen before. And I mark it as a Leenock Jokti jump because those are the first two guys who were not of the first or even second class of players, but maybe even the third class of players who had reached the top of the scene, at least for a brief moment in Jokji's case. And it had shown the depth of the field had risen to a much larger degree. And so that's how I call it. And this spans from the final season of GSTL of 2011 through the rest of the GSLs, the WCG, BlizzCon, BlizzCup era. And I'll start with the GSTL 2011, the final season. This is the first season where they have a much more elongated bracket where it's like two groups and then they play off against each other. And I believe it was a round robin, and then they play off into, and then they go into like a playoffs. And this wasn't that memorable of a season, to be honest, but there were a few funny things to point out. First was that there were still foreigner teams over there. OGS and TL had teamed up into one team house, but it was still the OGS coach, and the OGS coach was still pretty bad. The other part to point out was FXO was an all-foreigner team at this point. They had yet to buy out the Foyu clan, I believe. And so they had a bunch of foreigners over there, and they were the worst team in the league. But amazingly, QXC is able to all kill IM. And Team IM, by this point, had started to believe that the GSTL should only be used to train and practice the B-teamers because they were the ones that needed the help. And so they kept sending these B-teamers against QXC, and QXC kept slaying them. And then they eventually end up sending MVP to try to reverse sweep it, but it doesn't work out. QXC has a pretty smart and clever build that MVP isn't ready for, and since it's a best of one, QXC blindsides him and wins the match. And the Koreans, netizens, the ones that were watching StarCraft 2, they all went crazy. Like, they started giving him all these kinds of names, like Jesus Terran, Bandana Terran, because QXC was wearing the bandana at the time. Or my favorite one is Toto Destroyer, and Toto is just like a bet system where you bet on who's going to be the winner of any particular match or any particular like team league match, and you get a point for that. And everybody had bet on IM, and then QXC had killed all of their Totos apparently. So I always like that. And among all of QXC's accomplishments, this is the one that's most memorable for a majority of people. Though I think his last run at MLG is probably his best run, just my opinion. And then there was also the other team the foreigner team that became important. It was F United, which was a combination of some Korean players and a combination of some foreigner players, like Thorzane and Naniwa were teamed up in that team. And the reason they are important is because in the group they had to play against OGSTL, and then if OGSTL win, they move on to the playoffs. But if F United win, then Prime moves on to the playoffs. And F United is able to win because Phoenix gets a triple kill on OGSTL. It's literally the only thing Phoenix has done after only thing he's ever done internationally, I guess. That's how I'll phrase it. And this is the last thing he ever does, and it's to send Prime into the playoffs. In the playoffs, I believe MVP beats Prime soundly in the finals with. I don't even think they even had to send out Dongri-gu to finish it. Let me check to make sure, but I'm pretty sure that was the finals where, by that point, it illustrates what I call the Leenock jjakji jump in the sense that there were a bunch of other players besides the top players that were rising up, and the fact that the MVP didn't have to send Dongri-gu to finish it up for them kind of is an example of that. I believe they sent off other players. It was Noblesse, Vampire, Keen. I guess Genius they used, but he's like a more of an old school type. Whereas Prime's players were like Check, Terius, Boom Boom, Creator, Marine King. They tried to use in the finals, but he lost that one against Keen. So another reason to go into the GSTL 2011 is because there is at this point a new StarCraft 2 team called NS Hosa, and I'm not actually sure what it was, but it felt like it was supposed to be some kind of university club. NS Hosa was the name of that university, and they had a bunch of interesting and quirky players. Seal, for instance, was the first Zerg player to be obsessed with creep spreading, and he had a really great game. One great game in his entire career, it was against Bomber, where he took over the entire map with creep spread. It was like 90% creep spread or something crazy. There was Sage, who was a pretty smart player, very much based on Phoenixes, pretty good at PvP. And then they had a few others rising up players that never went anywhere. Their best player ends up being jjakji, and jjakji he's a little bit unorthodox. That's how I'll put it. Like, he had some small twists on the standard meta build, and at the time, apparently, he was very high up on the ladder, was going higher and higher up, and this would correlate eventually to his first and only GSL victory in November, I believe. And before we get to GSL November, there's GSL October, which was before that, and this season wasn't that interesting, except for actually not even the finals was that interesting. So it's more of a forgettable season. In GSL October, MMA and MVP run it all the way to the finals of the tournament. MMA TVT'd his entire way through, and MVP had a harder bracket. Beat Bomber, beat Nesty, ends up playing against MMA in the finals, and even though this tournament itself is less interesting compared to the other GSLs I've covered through this history series, this is arguably one of the most important matches of MVP's career, even though MMA wins it. And the reason this is such an important match is because MVP is soon going to fall under serious injuries, and I've researched it. Basically, as far as I know, it was some kind of pinched nerve issue where his spine, like the way his spine was, it like pinched his nerves so he couldn't feel the keyboard or the mouse, and he felt like extreme pain when he was practicing, so he couldn't practice for very long, and he basically just had to grit and bear it when he was actually playing the games as well. So the reason this is important is because MMA in the finals, he plays counter against the style he had usually played against MVP, because, at this point, even though MMA had the upper hand against MVP, it wasn't a sure thing if they had played out the normal styles. Like I had pointed out, MVP did beat MMA at Anaheim, and that was a more normal game for both of them. This time, MMA plays more of a Pult-esque style, where he and Coach Ryu Wan, and I haven't mentioned Coach Ryu Wan, but he ends up being probably the best StarCraft 2 coach in history, and he starts off as MMA's personal coach. And it's hard to say which one of them figured it out, because both of them are actually incredibly smart, and both MMA and Ryu Wan have shown quantifiable results where they've both shown they were able to counter, prepare, and defeat better opponents on their own without each other. So it's hard to say which one of them figured out, but maybe it's a collaboration this time. Either way, MMA figures out figures out that MVP's pretty weak to his current sets of builds are pretty weak to certain types of one base all ins or very aggressive two base all ins, and that's what MMA does. So it's a very boring finals, but MMA defeats it against MVP, and for MMA this is also a huge victory. So for MMA, this was the victory that basically powered him for the rest of his career in a sense, because this GSL October Finals was played in Anaheim at BlizzCon, and it was such a packed stadium, it's such a loud crowd, and everybody was cheering for MMA's name when he won that, and it always affected MMA in on a very deep level, where the rest of his career, even when he was in the slumps, he swore to himself, I would play one more time in front of the BlizzCon audience, no matter what it took. And this is like his final like promise, I guess. And there are times where there is no way he should have been able to do it, but he does eventually do it, and it's an incredible story. It's an incredible tale of perseverance in the face of like everything that was against MMA for what's about to happen to him in 2012 and onwards. And then for MVP, this was another important finals because MMA, the way he defeated MVP realized he had been countered in a sense, and he had been anti-stratted. And MVP, he isn't. This is something that's underrated about MVP, and something that I'd probably say there is no StarCraft 2 player that has this level of self-awareness as MVP does. And that is, MVP realizes how MMA defeats him, and unlike, say, Marine King or Nesty or almost any of the other greats, he figures out how MMA defeats him, and he doesn't stubbornly like stick to his own style, which is like the MVP style, which was like this very modern at the time mechanical based style that was based off of decision making and slow play and stuff like this. What MVP figures out is, at this point, there is another level of StarCraft 2 he had yet to touch. And this becomes an important point because MVP uses that loss, and he almost he takes what MMA does to him, and he takes it to the most extreme we will ever see in StarCraft 2 once the injuries affect MVP. And I think this is such an important loss for MVP to take, because the way he wins the rest of his career, everything that made MVP good up to this point almost disappears very soon. And so this loss is an incredibly important key moment for MVP. So keep an eye out for that. At the same time, like I said, GSL October was at BlizzCon, and also at BlizzCon was Nesty versus the MVP finals, where the two of them went all the way to the finals. They played against each other, and then there's a map where Nesty could have won. It was a split scenario, but MVP wins it because he's able to turtle up, get the max ghost, and then defeat Nesty's army. And at any point, you kind of realize like Nesty could have attacked, and maybe he could have won, or even if he kept attacking, probably could have effectively traded until MVP had run out of resources. And at the time, there was actually accusations of Nesty being a match fixer because, MVP had just lost the GSL October finals. So what if, in your mind, you're thinking, what if they had a deal to let MVP win this one to like boost his ego or whatever? And I always thought this one was bullshit, just because I don't know if like it doesn't seem very likely to boost one person's ego over the other. It might seem possible, though, to split the prize pool. But as for whether or not this was match fixing, I'll go ahead and say I don't think so, just because the way Nesty loses this finals is actually repeated over and 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 over again and again and again and again throughout the rest of Nesty's time in StarCraft 2. And basically, this is the biggest hole in Nesty's game that he never fixes, that nobody had ever seen before, because Nesty had built this rep as a macro player, but there's a key distinction here. Macro in the parts of 2011 that Nesty was prominent in did not go past what we would consider the late mid game, so to speak. And what I mean by the late mid game is the point where you're still constantly fighting with mutas, lings, and banglings against the Terran bio or the Terran mech or whatever, and nobody had ever gotten past that point. Not really. Like you can see it in TVT. They could go past that point. In a few instances of TVP, you could get past that point. In TVZ, it never gets past this point because obviously the only strategically viable option was the Mutaling Baneling because the queen hadn't been buffed yet, the Infestor hadn't been buffed yet, so it really was just like a scenario where you had to win in that era, in that specific phase of the matchup. And now that we go into an era where you get into that part, you see this gigantic hole in Nesty's gameplay that he loses over and over and over again. And probably the biggest throw of Nesty's career comes against Noble S in the Brood Lord Infestor era, where he's in the exact same position except with stronger units, with a better composition, and I don't know if he accidentally does this, but he basically just doesn't even attack move. He moves his army into Noble S's army, doesn't fight at all, just loses the entire army and then loses the game. And so, like I said, the reason I don't think it's a match throw is because Nesty continually repeated this mistake over and over and over again through the rest of his career. And then the other tournament I want to talk about, there's three more. WCG is a classic 2011 MVP tournament, very solid, basically destroyed everybody along the way. Pretty impressive because the Korean qualifiers were very tough, and he wins those, and then he wins the entire thing. But as for the games, I don't remember them being that great, to be honest. There is this funny little thing. If you see, there's like a documentary about MVP during this time, and he kind of just fucks with Supernova's head because Supernova had at that point become a very good TVT late game player, and he'd been famed for using Ravens, and then MVP and him are on the same taxi, and like MVP is just messing with his head on the way to the WCG finals. So I always thought that was a little bit funny. And then you have two tournaments left, the two big ones in my opinion. The first is GSL November, and this coincides with MLG Providence, the one I had talked about last time where Leenock had showed the world he was the best player in the world, or people were considering Leenock the best player in the world because he had beaten everybody except for jjakji. And jjakji was a player nobody had any eyes on, even in the GSL round of 8. There's this famous clip of Tasteless and Artosis like looking at the bracket like, oh, everybody quit except jjakji, and then Tasteless makes a sarcastic comment like, oh, I'm calling jjakji to win the GSL, you're hearing it now. And the whole point of that is because jjakji as a player hadn't shown anything really impressive throughout that GSL. Even in the GSL round of 16, like he was in a group with Koka, and Koka was a very impressive Zerg at the time, but Koka had to forfeit his spot. The reason was because he had somebody figured out that somebody just watched the VOD of Koka winning his Code S seed, because there was like a small online tournament where if you won it, you would get the Code S seed. That was like one of the special like things they sometimes did with Code S. And in the finals, he played against Byun. And the point is like Byun was already in Code S, so Byun had nothing to gain here. Whereas Koka really wanted that Code S seed, and Koka is basically just asking him to throw the game, and then Byun's like, fine, whatever. It's not like it affects him either way. And if Koka lost that game, Koka wouldn't have gotten the Code S seed, for instance. And that's why they did it. They go back. It's like in the chat logs, they weren't even trying to hide it. And he forfeits his spot. He forfeits his spot either voluntarily or from a punishment by Slayers or from GSL. It's hard to say with Korea. And so when you look at the way jjakji played throughout this tournament, like his TVT was decent, but he probably could have been eliminated by Supernova if Supernova had made a few better decisions in their TVT matchup, because it was this very weird situation with like very early Marauder bunker plays on both sides. And his TVP against Oz made you really think this guy wasn't going to get very far. And so you go into Jokji versus Leenock, and by this point, the GSL finals had gained this rep, rightly so, that all GSL finals were trash. And part of it is because there's no seeding, and the other part of it was the way the meta works. And so nobody was expecting anything from this finals, but I could say, like, when the finals started, this is one of those finals that stands up to the test of time. It's arguably still the best GSL finals ever played, and this is why I call it the Leenock Jokji jump in terms of skill, because both of them play to a level that neither of them had ever played to before. Leenock had just won LG Anaheim, and this was his best result. This was his best played game even at that point. And Jokji has a bunch of like these very cute, very smart, clever Overlord snipes, because he had figured out where Leenock was going to put his Overlords on every single map, his first one or two. And so he'd build one or two Marines, lit the barracks, and then he'd gain sight of the Overlord, and then the Marines would kill it, and he'd just keep doing this over and over and over again. But the real incredible thing about this series was how Jokji managed to deflect Leenock's constant aggression. And so the two of them basically kept forcing the game into this very odd and very fun scenario where they were both constantly expanding and constantly attacking and counterattacking against each other. And Leenock kept setting up these baneling traps, and Jokji kept setting up the Overlord traps and trying to maneuver and attack Leenock. It was a very fun game. Definitely watch it. And I remember one of the series where it was basically Leenock is able to base trade Jokji, and Jokji, in like desperation, he lifts all his buildings to come with him, and then because of Leenock baneling trapping the entire field, what Jokji does is he tries to land the barracks in areas he tries to land the barracks up and down over and over again. And the reason you do that is because if there are burrowed banelings there, that means the barracks can't land. And so if the barracks can't land, he could guess where the baneling mines were, and then he'd send a Marine up and then kill it with a siege tank to blow up the mines. There's a lot of creative thinking on both sides. It was a little messy at points, but it was also because neither of them had ever played against each other. And this is another part of like Jokji's GSL run that's extremely crazy, is he had never played a TVZ up to this point, and TVZ was his best matchup. And so nobody had seen him ever play this, so nobody, especially Leenock, had no idea what was about to happen. And it was an incredible series, all 6 games. Arguably the most skilled we've seen in a GSL finals on both sides. Depends on how you want to define what skill means, in a sense. And definitely one of the best finals in StarCraft 2 history. Definitely give that a rewatch. And it is, in my mind, the culmination of what I've been saying throughout, is then the rise of a bunch of these mid-tier, lower tier Korean players were starting to take over the top. And this continues in Dongdaegu versus MMA in the Bliss Cup finals, where it was another incredible finals, arguably one of the best StarCraft 2 finals we'd ever seen. MMA gets a quick 3-0, and you think it's going to be a very quick stomp in that finals, but Dongdaegu is able to reverse sweep. Not reverse sweep, he's able to get 3 back, so it's a 3-3 scenario. And the way MMA gets his 3 victories, it's very dominant. What Dongdaegu does is he starts throwing strategy upon strategy upon strategy and compositions that are very different from his normal stuff to completely throw MMA off, and it works. And then the final game is both of them playing their regular standard styles, with Dongdaegu finally being forced to use get to like a Broodlord tech, and he's about to win the game, except MMA because what's happening in the last vestiges of this game, right? It's very similar to the Leenock Jokji series, except it gets into this last vestiges of the game where Dongdaegu makes his last push into MMA's infrastructure, and MMA counts in his head the units and makes this like desperate like right click move with his tanks, because his tanks can't hit air, and hopes Dongdaegu doesn't notice. Dongdaegu doesn't notice because there's so much shit that's going on, and the tanks are able to make a counterattack and kill Dongdaegu's last potentially mining expansion. And this means Dongdaegu is all in on the attack, and MMA barely holds. MMA wins, and MMA wins the Bliss Cup finals. Very epic shit. And as a side note for this tournament, this is also a tournament where Naniwa is playing in. And Naniwa, even though he goes out last year, don't look at the results. Actually, look at the games. He actually played very good in every single one of those games. And that's actually why he tilts off the face of the earth when he's asked to play against Nestea. Because by this point in time, both Nestea and Naniwa were eliminated from the group. So Naniwa thought this was a completely pointless game. So he just pro pools and then does a micro as like a protest against this really stupid game. And this pisses everybody off in Korea, outside. And actually, I don't see why he should have been punished for that. It was a meaningless game. Maybe just like fine him or whatever, but he ends up losing a Codes seed because of it for a season, so he can reflect upon what he did, because obviously on some level pro gamers are there to put on a show, and it was unprofessional of him in a sense, just because you're supposed to try in those scenarios, because that's what you were paid to do, is like play in these competitive games. Obviously a bad look for him, bad look for his org, and one of the reasons why but Naniwa is such an interesting character, in my opinion, because the way his competitive drive works, I think he would have been disgusted if he had to play that game normally for a meaningless game. So it's like what made him so good was also what made him do that kind of thing. All right, so that covers the final tournaments of this era. There's actually a lot more I could go into on the specifics of the runs and the people they play against, but I think this covers the main points I wanted to get into, and if I ever decide to go back, I will. All right, see you guys later.